Now we move on to step number 2, computing output in terms of EUP, equivalent units of production. First, we need to recall our additional data. So let's talk about what happens within the cutting process. The cutting department of Peggy's Puzzles adds all direct material at the very end of the process. The direct materials used in the cutting department for Peggy's Puzzles are the boxes that hold the puzzle pieces. To help us visualize this, let's look at a timeline of the process. You can also think of this as a conveyor belt that runs from left to right. Puzzles start at the far left, where they are 0% complete for this process. They move through the timeline from left to right, and when they get to the right are 100% complete for the process. Some processes add the direct materials at the beginning, some add it at the middle, some add it at the end, or some even add them evenly throughout the process. The cutting department for this company adds the direct materials at the very end of the process, which is different from the assembly department, which added them at the beginning. So that means, for example, that if the ending work in process units were halfway through the cutting process, that means they have none of the direct materials applied to them because this particular department applies the materials at the end of the process. In fact, if the ending work in process units were 95% through the process, they would have 0% of the direct materials applied to them because they are not finished yet. This is important when we calculate the equivalent units of production for direct materials. But the conversion costs are a different matter. Remember, conversion costs are simply direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. Conversion costs are usually applied evenly throughout the process, and that's the case with this department. That means if the 7,000 ending work in process units were halfway through the process at the end of the period, then that would be equivalent of 3,500 units being fully completed for conversion costs. So we must calculate 3 items: EUP, equivalent units of production, for costs transferred into the cutting department, equivalent units of production for direct materials for the cutting department, and the equivalent units of production for conversion costs for the cutting department. These must be done separately because direct materials and conversion costs are usually added at different times in the timeline. So we have these whole units to account for. Our first task is to calculate the equivalent units of production for the transferred in costs. Remember, the cutting department receives units from the assembly department. So these units came in with costs assigned to them from the previous department, which was calculated on the production cost report for the previous department, which was the assembly department. If these units were not 100% complete with respect to the previous process, then they would not have been transferred into this department. Therefore, 100% of any costs associated with the work done in the previous department stay with these transferred in units at 100% EUP. This makes sense because these transferred in costs from the previous department were already 100% complete for that department, so we have to carry forward 100% of their costs into this department. If we did not, we would be understating the true costs of the puzzles. Now let's concentrate on the EUP, equivalent units of production, for the 38,000 units completed and transferred out. The 38,000 units came from the data table and were placed on the production report in the units accounted for section. Since these 38,000 units were transferred out of the cutting department, this means the cutting department is completely done with these 38,000 units. That means they are considered 100% complete for both direct materials and conversion costs. So, to calculate the equivalent units of production for the 38,000 completed and transferred out units, we simply take 38,000 units times 100% since they were completely finished, and we get 38,000 EUP for both direct materials and conversion costs. Now we simply place the 38,000 EUP on the production cost report for both direct materials and conversion costs. Now we will calculate the equivalent units of production for the 7,000 units that were in the ending work in process. Remember, this means they were unfinished. So now we need to know how far through the assembly process were these units at the end of the period. 70%? 50%? Well, to find out, we just need to consult our data table to find out that these 7,000 units were 30% complete at the end of July. So let's visually add them to the timeline in the upper right corner. So let's talk about direct materials first, then conversion cost later. For direct materials, at what point in the timeline do the direct materials get added? You can also think of the timeline as a conveyor belt with a starting point on the left and the puzzles moving to the right. Remember, our additional data says the direct materials are added at the end of this department's process. So the question is, of these 7,000 unfinished units, what percentage of them have had the direct materials, which is the box, added to them? Well, since the 7,000 units are only 30% through the process, and the direct materials are added only at the very end of the process, 0% of the puzzles have the direct materials added. So our calculation is 7,000 in-process units times 0% equals 0 equivalent units of production for direct materials. Now we simply place the 0 EUP on the production cost report for direct materials. Then for the direct materials column, we add the 38,000 EUP with 0 EUP and get a total of 38,000 EUP for direct materials. Now we will calculate the equivalent units of production for the conversion costs for the 7,000 units in ending work in process. Remember, these units were 30% complete per our data table. Also remember that conversion costs are added evenly throughout the process per our additional data table. So since these 7,000 units were only 30% complete, and conversion costs are incurred evenly throughout the assembly process, to calculate equivalent units of production, we take the 7,000 incomplete units and multiply by 30% to get 2,100 equivalent units of production for conversion costs. Now we simply place the 2,100 EUP on the production cost report for conversion costs, then add 38,000 for the completed units to the 2,100 for the incomplete units to get 40,100 total EUP for conversion costs. Now we are done with the hard part of the production cost report. The rest is pretty much simple arithmetic.